Hello and welcome to our special Holocaust Memorial live stream interview with Martin Sugarman, author and archivist of AJEX, which is the Association of Jewish Ex-Servicemen and Women of the UK. I am Lara, I run the events programme for Hillingdon Libraries, and I'm particularly pleased we've been able to work with Martin and AJEX on the topic of fighting back and the part Holocaust survivors and other groups played in the military. This is an interactive event, so do please pass on your comments in the comment box below, and we will pass them on to Martin either throughout or at the end of the event. I will now pass over to my colleague Jason, who is a library's history buff, and he will speak to Martin. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, as I said, my name's Jason. I'll show you the book that we're talking about. It's called Fighting Back. It's Martin's book. Tremendous amount of information, as you can see in there. It covers people, Jewish people from Britain, from the continent, from the Middle East, who were involved in the Second World War, who took the offensive to the Nazis. So we've got a range of questions we're going to talk to Martin about. So our first question is, you write about the myth of British Jews lacking fighting spirit and participation in the Second World War in your book. I wondered how prevalent this was during the war and afterwards.
Yes, it was, and in fact in the First World War as well. I'm afraid anti-Semitism is a light sleeper, and it's often difficult to prove, but it stinks like hell. And even in my own family, I remember as a boy hearing stories about the way in which when they joined up, my uncles, my father, there was a lot of anti-Jewish feeling among the soldiers and sailors and airmen they served with, but only usually during the training period. Afterwards, when they were actually in theatre, as they called it, and all undergoing the same stress and strain of fighting, they became friends. And at the same time as speaking about the anti-Semitism they met, which was often settled, by the way, with a round of fisticuffs. Many of the Jewish lads often had been boxing champions and athletes in their youth, particularly those from the East End. They became friends, and they always talked about their many non-Jewish friends in the forces. So it wasn't unusual. It was quite common, name calling and that kind of thing, but it usually settled down. And this continued throughout and until the end of the war.
That's very interesting, isn't it? That the way the relationship changed.
Yes,
it's quite, yeah. I'm sure there's lots of parallels there with other groups of people as well.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that was a very nice answer. I'll move on to my second one. I'll put my earphones in, I think. So, okay. So before the war, many Jews from the continent fled from the Nazis and came to Britain. At the outbreak of the war, many people were interned because it wasn't known what their status was, such as places as the Isle of Man. I wondered whether this had a negative impact upon the number of continental Jews who eventually enlisted in the British military.
No, not at all. In fact, it had the opposite effect. These men and women were dying to have a crack at the Nazis. They had left, in many cases, when they came over with the Kinder transport, left families in Europe. They knew what they were facing. They knew why they'd been sent away. They understood that. And they were wanting to join up, whatever the cost. They understood, when you read the books and listen to the interviews and meet them, as I have over the years, they understood why the British did this. It's because, as you say, they weren't sure if there were German spies who'd been infiltrated into these groups of refugees. But once that had all been settled and they'd been released, they were allowed to join the forces, and they were so keen that when they were sent to places like the Pioneer Corps, which is basically a labour battalion, they wanted to get out. They just wanted to get in fighting units, and they volunteered for all kinds of special forces, as we'll touch on probably later in the talk, and did fantastic work. No, it never put them off at all. They were just gung-ho to have a crack at the Nazis and also to help everyone else fight for freedom against fascism.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. Did Jews who served in the British military from across Britain and the Empire and beyond from different territories have different attitudes to the war and Britain?
Not really. The main Commonwealth countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Jewish communities there, and the Jews living in Israel in the Mandate, they were all dead keen to fight fascism. They were all anti-fascist, and they wanted to do their bit. There was no real difference in attitude. The Jews in Israel were waiting. Of course, they were a nation in waiting. They knew that at some stage there would probably be a confrontation with the British, who of course were ruling at the time in the Mandate. But other than that, during the war, 39-45, there was, if you like, a complete ceasefire between the two. Everybody knew they faced a common enemy, and basically the answer to your question is there was no real difference. The Canadian Jews had the same attitude, the Australians, and so on. And incidentally, there was a small but very active Jewish community in India. Most of those have left and migrated away to Israel in the modern period. But a lot of them were serving in the Indian forces, in Indian regiments.
Was that the community from, was it Goa?
There was in Goa, but also in Cochin and in other parts of India and in the big cities like what is now Mumbai. Yes, that's right, absolutely right. Many of them were officers.
That's very interesting. Okay, lovely. We'll move on to the next one then. In comparison to the mass of the British people, was there a greater knowledge of Nazi anti-Semitism and the persecution of the Jews amongst British Jews due to family and or other connections?
Yes, of course. They had a high stake in this. Many of them had extended families left in Europe. If their parents, although they had been born in Britain, their parents had brothers and sisters and cousins and grandparents and so on in Europe, particularly in Poland, Russia, and even in Germany itself, of course, Holland. Some of my family came from. And yes, they knew absolutely. But the British newspapers were pretty good on publicising this stuff. And there was a large movement within the church, among the Quakers, Church of England, attending rallies and demonstrations to boycott German goods because of the anti-Semitic feeling and what was happening to the Jews in Europe, right up until when the war began. So, yeah, you know, the British Jews were aware. The refugee Jews who were here, of course, were very aware. But so was basically the rest of the country. I think there was no hiding it.
Great, thank you. This next question may seem a bit obvious, but to what extent was this a motivation for the people who enlisted?
Oh, absolutely.
I think we touched on this before, but
yeah, we touched on it before. I mean, I can only repeat. There was the common enemy of the fascism and Nazism, which was a threat to everybody, and they were particularly, of course, a threat to the Jews. And they joined up very gung ho. In fact, two of my uncles, Dennis Andrews and Sid Hyams, both East End boys who went to the Oxford and St George Club in Whitechapel, they lied about their age to get in the Navy. They could only get in the Navy. The Army wouldn't take them. They were too young. And they were both 16 years old, but they got themselves in and fought throughout the war.
Wow. Was there a different age on joining the Navy then?
You could get it, well, put it this way, you could persuade a Navy enlistment office more easily than the Army, and certainly than the Air Force. The Air Force are very picky. You had to have good general education, particularly if you wanted to be a pilot. But they managed to get into the Navy, frankly, by just lying about their age. Having birth certificates and stuff like that, like we have today, there was very little of that. The sergeant major or the enlisting officer would say, go round the block twice and come back when you're 18, which
oh, great. Okay, leading on from that then, it's quite a nice link. The British military had a very diverse range of services during the war. Were there any services that Jewish service personnel particularly favoured, or were there any regional associations?
I don't think there were any regional associations. The Jewish community has always lived mainly in the urban areas, and they all joined up in great numbers. No, I think that Martin Gilbert, who wrote the introduction to my book, said summed it up and said there wasn't any branch of the military during the Second World War where Jews did not serve. It depended, like everybody else, on their skills and their knowledge and their abilities. But there was a higher than average proportion of Jews in special forces. They wanted this physical contact with the Germans. A good example is the German Jewish refugees from 3 Troop, number 10 Commando. They were all refugees who'd been in the Pioneer Corps mostly, and they volunteered as soon as they were acceptable by the British authorities for the Commandos and trained in Abu Dhabi in West Wales and in Eastbourne, cliff climbing. And on D-Day, they were the tip of the spear. They were split into small groups with the other British commando units, and they were first on the beaches because they spoke German and had interrogation skills. And they had also been trained about talking in enemy soldiers to surrender, which was not difficult for them because they could talk to them. And these guys also enlisted in the paratroopers for the same reason. We had well over 120 Jewish paratroopers at the Battle of Arnhem, for example, in September 44, and a lot of them were in the 21st Independent Parachute Brigade, about 25% of them, or company, and they were the first in. They were the pathfinders. They laid the little devices down so that when the main flight of gliders came in, they knew where to land. They were to hold the landing grounds. And a lot of these guys were German Jews, and they knew it was a suicidal mission if they were caught on the ground. They were lightly armed. They were there to put the lighting devices down. And if the book by Kemp, which is in the bibliography of my book at the back, is right, he said that the first 7 down were from the German Jewish group who laid down the devices at that battle. And the same happened on the eve of D-Day. A lot of the paras from the Airborne Division were Jewish fellows who went in with the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry and Lovett's Commandos. They were there right at the front because they were wanting to basically get their own back.
Was that at Pegasus Bridge? Was that
there were Jewish lads at Pegasus Bridge, yes, that's absolutely right. And my own uncle, Harry Kruger, what a lot of people don't realise is there were 2 bridges. There was the Pegasus Bridge, which was taken by the Ox and Bucks. We had 2 Jewish boys there. But there was another bridge further down, the Orne River Bridge. And these guys went in, not on D-Day, they went in the night before to take it at night. And my Uncle Harry was with the 11th Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment, who were called the Red Devons, because the whole battalion were volunteers as paratroopers, and they landed in gliders very early in the morning of D-Day and took the bridge further downstream. It's the one that's forgotten about in the stories, but still a wonderful story.
So I don't think they show that bit in the old film, The Longest Day, do they?
The Longest Day, they showed the Pegasus Bridge one.
Yeah.
Major Howard, yeah.
Lovely. So moving on a bit to sort of life within the services. How were Jewish people treated within the British military? For example, were they stereotyped or nicknamed in the way that many Scots and Welsh people seem to have been daubed as Jock or Taffy?
Yeah, there was a lot of that. Some of it was good-humoured. Some of it was pretty nasty. But as I said before, it was largely forgotten about, and it was also fairly rare. I don't want to take up too much time on this, but there are loads of stories I've heard from the veterans who I interviewed. The German Jewish refugees often had quite a lot of fun with it because they had slight accents. They were trying to perfect their English accent in case, of course, they were captured. They all changed their names. You know, Cohen became Collins and Goldstein became Gordon. And they would tell people, particularly 3 Troop, for example, if they were questioned by local people when they were training, they'd say, "Oh, I'm from Newcastle, and my accent, you probably won't recognise it." But of course, they were trying to hide a German accent, and they would kind of try and fool people into saying they came from a different region somewhere in England.
Okay, lovely. So, sort of relating to this, really, were there experiences of anti-Semitism in the British military, and if so, was this the minority experience or the majority experience?
Everyone I never met a Jewish veteran who didn't experience it, but they all said that it was short-lived. So nothing really to write home about. There were often scraps. My own father got into a fight with a guy once, but once it was settled, everybody seemed to respect each other. There was quite a lot of understanding, particularly in the experience of after the experience of the First World War. If a Jewish soldier wanted to keep kosher, as far as possible, they did provide kosher food. But this was more difficult abroad than it was in Britain. Other than that, they were allowed to attend Saturday services. At Christmas, the Jewish lads volunteered to stay on duty if they could go home on Passover, that kind of thing. There was lots of assisting the Jews to keep their faith. The Jewish chaplains, we had well over 30 Jewish chaplains in uniform, many of whom served abroad, 3 of whom died. And the Jewish chaplains had free access to all the Jewish troops. They could go to any camps, barracks, and hold services, go to squadron bases, visit the harbours when ships came in, and see as many of the Jewish lads as they could. And by the way, that resulted in 70,000 Jewish chaplain cards, which we have in our museum. Every Jewish chaplain kept a little library card, like the old-fashioned library cards we used to have in our libraries years ago, and it carried the name, rank, number of the man, his address, next of kin, if he'd been wounded, if he'd been sick, if he'd won an award. And this resource is a fantastic source of information for us about what the Jewish guys were doing and where they were during the Second World War. In the First World War, the equivalent was in a book called the British Jewry Book of Honour, which was published after. And at the same time, the Jewish Chronicle newspaper published stories from the front, from the soldiers, and who was in and who was wounded and sadly who'd been killed. So we have a huge paper record of the service of the Jewish people, including those refugees serving in the British Army.
Thank you. You've already touched on it before, but many Continentals who served in the British military, as you said, did used to have false names to hide their nationality in case of capture. But was this also a practice or issue with British Jews?
With some. I've met veterans who said that when they joined up, their officers would say to them, you're going into action, we don't know how the Germans are going to behave with our Jewish soldiers. You might want to change your name, put COV on the dog tag. Some of them agreed. This created a huge problem if they were killed, because they were often put under a cross rather than the Star of David that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission used. And we've had to change hundreds of them since the Second World War, from crosses to stars. But most of them said, no, I'm not going to do this. This is like giving the Nazis a victory. I will go in with my religion and my name on my dog tag. I'm proud of it. And few of them changed it. But with special forces, they were ordered to change their dog tags and their names. So 3-10 Commando, they all took English sounding names and had COV on their dog tags. The Special Interrogation Group, these were German speaking Jews from Israel who dressed up as German soldiers and went behind the lines in North Africa. They had to take new identities and sometimes no dog tags at all. So it varied depending on the situation, but most British Jews would not change their identities. We had one guy, an officer, I forget his name, I was looking for it this morning, who sadly was killed at the Battle of Cassino. He did put a false name and religion on his dog tag. And we have the letter in our museum from his parents when he was buried with a cross on his grave. The commission changed it. They wrote and said his identity was false and they could prove it through his army records. So it varied, but mostly people kept their real IDs.
Thank you. So next question, were there any theatres of the war or actions, and again you've touched upon this, in which the Jewish presence was especially felt or important? Absolutely.
In the RAF 101 Squadron had a special device in their aircraft called ABC, Airborne Cigar. And it was a jamming device to jam the radios of German fighters who were seeking out the British bombers. 101 Squadron had to have an eighth man in the crew who spoke German, so they could recognize the Germans when they started talking on their radios. And a lot of these were German Jewish refugees. Eric Hefford, for example, who his real name was Herzog, Gerhard Heilig, who was one who wouldn't change his name, many others, and they flew as the eighth man. The 101 Squadron had the highest casualties of the whole of Bomber Command, and Bomber Command had the highest casualties of any British unit in the Second World War, because every bomber stream had to have at least 3 101 Squadron Lancasters with them, because they were one at the back, one at the front, one below, to jam the German night fighter radios. So they couldn't talk to their control, and the fighters, control on the ground, couldn't talk to their German fighters. So there were a lot of Jews in that particular unit, both refugees and British Jews who spoke Yiddish. If you spoke Yiddish, you could understand German, because there were a lot of German words. At Bletchley Park, there were a lot of German Jewish refugees who were translators. The Ettinghausen brothers, who had escaped in 1938-39, got to Britain. The older brother, Walter, joined the army straight away, and he was straight away sent to given a travel warrant to go to Bletchley Park. In my book, there's a whole section about this. He was a German Jewish refugee. His brother joined him soon after. They were headhunted and told to go to Bletchley. The reason is that once the codes were broken, they had to be translated from the German into English. And to do that, you had to know German slang and military words, and only a German speaker could do that. You could study German at university in England, but you couldn't necessarily understand the Germanese used in these special messages that the code breakers were breaking. So there were a lot of people doing translation. The Ettinghausens were one of them, 2 of them rather. And there's a guy called Rolf Nosquith, a German Jewish refugee, who came from a wealthy German family of textile manufacturers. He was headhunted immediately. He got to Britain. He went to university, but they pulled him out. And he broke the codes of the Geheimschreiber, which was the one stage up from the Enigma. The story is in my book. He never boasted about it or talked about it. I interviewed him before he died, and he was never recognized for it. But in the last years of his life, he went to some of the reunions, and he was always greeted by the museum curators there with a massive pat on the back, because they knew who he was. So Bletchley Park was another specialist area where Jews served. And the commandos I've mentioned, and the SIG especially, chapter in the book, you held it up. There is a second edition, blue cover, which is more up to date because I added a few chapters. The SIG were just astonishing. I interviewed 3 of them. They were all living in Israel, but one came to Britain to see his family here, and I was able to talk to him, Morris Tiffenbrugger. Their stories are quite unbelievable, what they got up to. They would dress up as Germans and go behind the lines and set up roadblocks, and they questioned German convoys. They would map where the tank parks were, where the aircraft aerodromes were, and they take all this stuff back, and then the RAF would go in and bomb it. And that's basically how Rommel was defeated. They would go with the long-range desert group, who were special forces. A lot of Jews served in the LRDG, and the SAS. A lot of the SIG men went into the SAS after the SIG was disbanded after the Battle of Tobruk, and they would guide them into these aerodromes where they would shoot up the aircraft. And it's known that the SAS, SIG in long-range desert group destroyed more aircraft on the ground than the RAF could shoot down in North Africa. That's what they got up to. It's absolutely astonishing. It's also worth pointing out that a lot of Israelis, both German Jewish refugees who've gone to Israel during the mandate before the war, and native Israelis who've been there forever, they trained with the British SAS at a place called Atlit. Atlit is near Haifa, It's still today one of Israel's Special Forces training bases for frogmen. It's an open secret. And a lot of the guys went on raids from there with the British SAS and SPS Special Boat Squad. And one particular group I'd just like to mention were the Operation Boatswain. This was an SOE operation. And SOE was another place where Jews served in huge numbers, because knowing France and Germany and Poland and places from where they'd come, they were the best people to parachute with the special operations behind the lines during the war to help the resistance groups on the lead up to D-Day. These guys from Israel went on an operation with Boatswain in 1941 to blow up the Vichy French oil refineries in Tripoli in Lebanon, where the Vichy French were fighting a very nasty war with Britain and the Anzac troops. Sadly, all 23 of them were lost, though no one knows what happened to it. There's a mention of it in my book. There are books being written about this particular operation. The SOE officer who went with them, Anthony Palmer, his young body was found, and he's buried, I think, in a British war grave cemetery in Lebanon. So astonishing and amazing stories, yes.
Yeah, quite incredible. Really good, really. Moving on to the next question. What role did Jewish women play in the armed services?
It was huge. Among the chaplain cards we have are several thousand sections divided into ATS, RENs, and WAFs. And they were doing all the jobs that normally women would be doing, plotting in the air bases, drivers, ambulance drivers of all kinds, and secretarial work. But some of them volunteered for special missions. Muriel Bick was in the WAFs, and she came from West London. Her parents were French Jews who'd come to Britain in the 1920s, and she joined SOE. She was headhunted for SOE because she spoke fluent French. She'd been to the Lycée Française in Kensington and done a year at a university in France. She was parachuted into France, and she sent many important messages back. She was responsible for the information which led to the destruction of the Le Creusot factory, which was making pots and pans in peacetime, but was building tanks for the Germans, forcibly building tanks at the time. And the RAF bombed that as a result of her information. Sadly, she died of meningitis and is buried in Pornic in Brittany. She was one of the very few SOE agents who has a known grave, because most of the SOE agents, especially the Jews, if they were captured, were murdered in the death camps, and they have no known graves. So Muriel was one of those. Another was Denise Bloch. She was a French Jewish refugee who came over in 1941-42. She was especially extracted by SOE over the Pyrenees because she was very active in the French partisan units. She was trained by SOE in the grand houses around Britain as a radio operator. She was also captured and betrayed by a traitor in her group. She ended up with Violet Szabo, who won the George Cross from London, in the camp at Ravensbrück, and they were both murdered in the death pit there. And if you see the film, Carve Her Name Pride with Virginia McKenna, Denise Bloch is played by one of the other actresses, and she is the lady and another French resistance fighter shot with her in the last scene of the film. So there were lots of Jewish women in SOE, and from Israel there were several. Hannah Senesh and Haviva Reich were both captured and murdered, but their bodies were found and brought back and are buried in Israel at Mount Herzl Cemetery. Sarah Braverman survived. She only died a few years ago. She was the last survivor of the 30 Jewish agents of SOE who parachuted into the Balkans. So it's quite a story, amazing story. And lots of Jewish women served in the Fire Brigade. I've got several interviews in my other book about Jews in the fire service in the Second World War. One of the Jewish fire women was killed, Susan Sussman, but several were very active during the Blitz, driving fire station chiefs to the sites so that they could direct the firefighting. Yes, an amazing story. And because many of them were in the land army, we've got several testimonies and stories and photographs of that. And of course, many were working in war industries, building bombers, building tanks. But they were everywhere. My own mother was making uniforms in a textile factory in Princeville Street. So they were everywhere.
Great information, great achievements, really. Well, again, we're moving on to a question which you've touched upon quite a lot. That is that you write about an estimated 8,000 or so German and Austrian Jews who had fled from the Nazis, come to Britain, who jokingly referred to themselves as His Majesty's most loyal enemy aliens.
Yeah, that's right.
And as well as Jews from the Middle East, which you already mentioned, with German backgrounds. Now, these people served in the British military, as you said, in special forces, where the knowledge of Germany and the language was a great asset. I was going to ask you to expand upon it. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add upon about those people.
Yeah, quite a lot, because it's such a huge topic, which is why people should read the book. The list of agents, Jewish agents who were in SOE. Some of you may have heard of a man called Peter Churchill, who was one of the chief SOE agents for Britain in France. He managed several of the resistance. He wasn't related to Winston, that was just his name. And he sent a letter, which we've got in our archives, to AJEX many years ago before he died. Highly decorated man, saying that you asked me how many Jews did I come across in SOE. I can tell you that the Special Operations Executive, one of the most dangerous branches of special forces, the Jews were legion. They were hugely numerous. Many of them British Jews, like the ones I write about in my book. Marcus Bloom, for example, who was born in the East End and lived in Tottenham. But also lots of German Jews. Yogi Meyer was part of a group with Stephen Dell, whose real name was Spangler, called Force 12. These were German Jews who were parachuted into Germany in the last 6 months or so of the war to try and assassinate leading German officers who were, it was known from intelligence, were speaking of setting up last stand positions to make the life difficult for Allied soldiers, which would cost many lives. Some of them were captured and killed, like Frederick Benson, whose real name was Buchdal. Some escaped and lived to tell the tale. Stephen Dell, whose wife was in the fire brigade, by the way, in London, both German Jewish refugees. He was captured, but managed to fool the Germans into letting them think that he was an ordinary soldier and not Jewish and certainly not German. He survived the war and wrote a book about his experiences. There have been documentaries on TV about these guys in recent years on programs like the Yesterday Channel. Yeah, it was huge. But one area I haven't mentioned, which is in this book I wrote on another branch of the services where we knew nothing about the Jewish service, was the Merchant Navy. And there was a guy called Karl Sperber, who was a Slovenian Jew, got to Britain, he was a doctor. He couldn't get a job in the British medical services because he had foreign qualifications. So he joined the Merchant Navy as a ship's surgeon. Unbelievably, he was on a ship in the Far East during the war, captured by the Japanese. They handed him over to the Nazis because he was a German citizen, so they thought. And he ended up in a Merchant Navy prison camp in Germany, and he was awarded the MBE because he saved hundreds of British soldiers dying from diphtheria when they had no drugs. They caught diphtheria in the camp, and he used an old-fashioned method of wrapping them all in hot cloths. They used to do with children in poverty-stricken areas in Britain years ago, and saved their lives. And this got out at the end of the war, and he was given the MBE. He was an example of a Merchant Navy man. There was another guy from Israel, a Jewish German refugee called Moshe Abramsky, who became the captain of a merchant ship in the British Merchant Navy. And when Tobruk was under siege and British and Australian and New Zealand troops were trapped there, they had to be fed and their ammunition had to be taken in by ship. Abramsky was carrying ammunition and food, and he was warned not to enter the harbour because it was being bombed by Stukas, and that was a volatile cargo. It would have been completely destroyed. He said, "No way, I'm not letting these guys down." And this is on Australian War Museum film of his boat actually coming into the harbour, and all these Anzac soldiers running forward to grab the ammunition while he supervised the unloading, and all these German planes are bombing. So he was given the MBE for courage, for taking his ship in and supplying the men. So, and lots of stories about the Merchant Navy, and also in the Fire Brigade book, the great story is, of course, Harry Errington, who won the George Cross, but he wasn't, he was the son of Polish Jewish immigrants. It's interesting that we need to differentiate between Jews who escaped the Holocaust and came here as foreigners and served in the forces, the British Jews and Commonwealth Jews who served in the British forces anyway, who were Brits. And then you've got another group that came from via Israel to serve in the British forces. 30,000 of them were accepted. And then there's another group, which we haven't even mentioned, and these are the group Jews who were trapped in Europe, but who didn't go to the slaughter. They joined partisan groups. There were whole partisan groups in France and Poland made up just of Jews. You've seen the film Defiance with Daniel Craig. This is a true story, the Bielski brothers, but there were several partisan groups like that. And then, of course, there's the supreme courage of the Jews who rebelled in the death camps. There was a major rebellion at Sobibor. A book and film has been made about that. Claude Lanzmann interviewed survivors in the film Shoah. I urge everybody to watch that. The major rebellion at Treblinka, another death camp. These were extermination camps. These are not concentration camps. And of course, there was a major rebellion at Auschwitz. And a woman, a Jewish Russian woman, Rosa Roberta, smuggled small amounts of gunpowder from a factory where she was working into the camp. And when they had enough for a bomb, that was the bomb that blew up the crematoria, one of them only in Auschwitz. Very famous stories written about this. So these people, they were suicidal. They knew they were going to die, but they were going to take some of the enemy with them. And of course, we mustn't forget to mention the ghettos, the uprisings in the ghettos. There were the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of April 43 at Passover. They specifically chose Passover, the Festival of Freedom, to rebel on that day, and the fighting went on for 3 weeks until virtually all of them were killed. And if you go, as I have, to Warsaw and see the memorial at Mila 18, where the headquarters was, where the last group were killed, it's very, very powerful stuff. These Jews were also fighting back, but they knew they had virtually no chance. Very few survived, some survived, but most of them were killed.
Thank you. Move on to the next question. Although it's important to recognise the broad range of people who served in the military during the war, and obviously it's very difficult to quantify the impact of individual service, I wondered whether you'd like to speak about any particular individuals that you write about in your book or from during the war. For example, I found the chapter on Jack Nissenthal especially interesting in regards to his actions on the raids and Dieppe.
Absolutely.
Which is often regarded as being a great failure, but actually there was a great wealth of intelligence that was gained from that, which was used later on during the war, including the D-Day landings.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right about that. And of course, there are many people like Jack who did these very brave things. The Jewish guy from the East End, his parents were immigrants, and what he discovered by the cutting of the cables, which meant the Germans had to use radar and radio to speak to the other radars, led to the British being able to pick up those radio signals, therefore being able to block German radar on D-Day, which saved thousands of lives. And that's just one story. If you add to that individuals, for example, George Lane, who was a member of 3 Troop, he didn't go over on D-Day. The reason is he was already a prisoner. Before D-Day, they had a series of operations by commandos called Operation Tarbrush. They sent commandos over dropped them from submarines in kayaks to go to the beaches in Normandy and test the sand and pebbles, because they knew at Dieppe they'd made the colossal mistake of not understanding that tanks can't get up certain beaches. And these guys had to take soil augers with them, and they would take a soil sample from the beaches and bring it back. But George Lane was on several of these raids and won the MC, but on one of them he was captured. Now, this is a man from Hungary, speaking English, and he was taken directly to see Rommel in his headquarters in Normandy. This is a true story. It's in the books. And Rommel interviewed him. He wanted to see him. He was a fairly honourable man, Rommel. He knew that this guy was very brave, having come on this raid. And George Lane says, his real name was Georg Lunyi, by the way. He said he reckoned Rommel knew who he was and could have easily have handed him over to the SS, who would have tortured and killed him because of Hitler's commando order, all commandos to be shot. But Rommel questioned him, joked with him a little bit, asked him who he thought was going to win the war. Of course, a few weeks later, Rommel was dead. Hitler had him murdered, as you know, because of the July plot. And he was sent to a prison camp instead. And George Lane then told the senior British officer, he thought he knew where Rommel's HQ was. And a few days later, Spitfires were sent over on a daily, hourly basis to patrol this road, and told, if you see a German staff car, shoot it up. There'll be somebody important in it. And that's how Rommel was wounded quite badly, and as a result wasn't in Normandy on D-Day. And that had a huge effect on the landings, because Rommel may have made different decisions about repelling the landings, but he wasn't there. He was in Paris visiting his wife, recovering from wounds because of his attack. Lots of other stories like that of individual Jewish bravery. Jerry Flamberg, who was a paratrooper at Arnhem, won the military medal for killing a tank and saving his platoon from destruction. He was then captured and spent the last year of the war in prison. Leo Heap was working for SOE, but was a paratrooper at Arnhem. He was a Canadian Jew who managed to hide dozens and dozens of British paras who'd escaped the Germans after the battle and were hiding in woods near Arnhem. And he organized 2 or 3 crossings of the Rhine to bring these guys out. Several hundred were saved in this way, and he was given the Military Cross for that. There are loads of stories like this, really heroic people, and not just British Jews. The head of SOE in Denmark, in occupied Denmark, was Jewish, Ole Lipman. He only died about 10 years ago. But he was responsible for organizing the Danish resistance. They did a lot of damage to German merchant shipping, because of course the Germans had to go through around northern Denmark to get back to their bases on the Baltic coast. And they were sabotaging German merchantmen. I mean, I could go on all day. And if you look at the list of SOE Jews in my book, although I've only said a very short piece about them because there simply isn't the space, if you Google and you find out a bit about more what they did, you'll see the colossal contribution that they made to victory and the downfall of the Nazis.
Yeah, there's a vast wealth of actions there, and the history of it as well. It's just astounding, really, isn't it?
Can I just add one other thing I've forgotten?
Yeah.
People I do like to mention, the Dam Busters. We had 2 Jewish lads, 2.5 actually, one of them whose father was Jewish, called Stone from Winchester. His father was a refugee from Russia. We had 2 Jewish lads on the Dam Busters raid, sadly both of them killed. Abe Garshowitz was from Toronto, and his plane was shot down. Sorry, his plane hit a pylon on the way to the raid, and I've been to the crash site on the battlefield tour, and the local Germans in the village nearby where it crashed have a museum about the war, about the Jews from their town who were taken away, but they have a whole section about Abe Garshowitz because they were conscious of the fact that one of the bombers carried this man and he was Jewish. The other guy was Jack Gutterman, who was a British Jew from West London. His parents were Jewish immigrants. He was also an artist. His plane was shot down on the way back. And they're both buried together at, I think it's Reichwald Forest Cemetery, Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery, with Stars of David on their headstones, with their comrades. The two crews are buried together, 7 and 7. And Abe and Jack are together.
Yeah, it's all most definitely worth remembering, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe move after the war now. I was interested in the fact that many people such as free Poles stayed in Britain after the war. And I wondered whether there was a similar process with sort of continental Jews who'd served in the British military, decided to stay on in Britain and make a home for themselves.
Absolutely. I interviewed quite a lot of Polish Jewish ex-servicemen and 1 or 2 Czechs who'd mostly been in the Air Force, but also the Army. One Polish guy being in the Navy, the Free Polish Navy. Some of their ships escaped and came to Britain in 1939. Yes, in fact, the Polish Jewish ex-servicemen, there were so many of them in Britain, they had their own organization, the Association of Jewish Polish Ex-Servicemen, and the same with the Czech Jews. Many came over with the Free Czech forces and then went back and fought in North Africa, in Italy, at Cassino, and on D-Day. There were about a dozen Polish Jewish paratroopers with the Polish Parachute Battalion on D-Day. In the film Bridge Too Far, you see them trying to cross the river. They did eventually get across, and 2 of them were buried at Worcester Beach Cemetery. But Polish war graves do not put Stars of David or crosses on their graves, so you don't know who's Jewish unless you've done the homework. But after about 1970, the Polish and Czech service units joined AJEX because there were fewer of them and they were that little bit older and they passed away. So they amalgamated with us. They did astonishing things. The Polish Air Force squadrons, 303 Squadron, for example, and the Czech squadrons were very gung-ho. I mean, these guys volunteered. You didn't always get sent. Sometimes you volunteered for raids. And they were very anxious to go and bomb the Germans if they could. Some of them have astonishing stories about near misses and crash landings at Woodbridge in Suffolk. Special aerodrome was there with big sand pit at the end so a bomber could land and crash in the sand without exploding, it was hoped. Astonishing. They had astonishing stories. And yes, they did indeed stay behind, but and lived in Britain. But in addition to that, there were the German Jews who stayed on in Germany after the war in the denazification process, and others who were in the revenge squads. Now, there have been documentaries about it. These were guys who went around bumping off Nazi war criminals after 1945, because they knew that Nuremberg was only going to go for the big fish. And they had intelligence from Israel of the names and addresses of camp commandants, of mass murderers, people who'd taken part in the killings of the death pits in the forests of Poland. They knew where to find them, and they went after them. It was all strictly illegal. They wore their British Army uniforms. They were in the Jewish Brigade. This was an Israeli fighting force only of Jews from Israel, 5,000 Jewish Brigade in 3 battalions. They fought in Italy, but they were after the war criminals. And quite a lot of them managed to find them. They would go at night in their uniforms. They got vehicles from sympathetic British and French and American officers in the occupying forces in Germany. They would go into the house. They would ask to see the wife and the children, and they would explain that these men were war criminals. They probably didn't know it, but they are being arrested for crimes against the Jewish people. And they were taken away, shot, and buried in unmarked graves. It's reckoned about 200 suffered this fate. And among the men who did it, the men of the Jewish Brigade, plus some of the Jewish partisans who survived. There was even a plan to poison reservoirs in Germany to kill people. But David Ben-Gurion in Israel said, no, on no account, these are innocent people. And the plan was dropped. There's a book written about this by Michael Elkins. I urge you to read it. But these were Holocaust survivors and ghetto survivors, and they were very bitter. Not all of them. Some of them learnt to forgive. But I remember seeing an interview by a guy called Sugarman, my namesake, Sugarman, Polish Jewish fighter who got out of the ghetto in Warsaw. And he said, "When I die, you can cut out my heart and you will see that it is of the colour black." That's how bitter I am. Because he was right in the middle of it and saw the slaughter in the Warsaw ghetto.
Was there direct connection between those people from the Jewish Brigade and later Israeli actions around the world?
Absolutely. The Jewish Brigade, there is a continuum. You've got the Shomer, the guards of the 19th century who looked after the Jewish farms and towns on horseback, mostly against Bedouin bandits. Then came the First World War, the Zion Mule Corps, who were all Jews from Israel who served at Gallipoli, and the Jewish Legion, the 38th, 42nd Battalions of Law Fusiliers who fought in Israel against the Turks and helped the reconquest of Palestine Mandate, and many of them stayed and lived there. The 38th Battalion were all raised in London. They were all Jews from London. The 39th from the United States, Canada and Argentina, and the 40th Battalion were Jews from Israel who were refugees in Egypt, where the British still held control. And those guys went into the Haganah in the interwar years and protected the Jewish farms and towns and villages, and then joined the British Army and went into the Palestine Regiment, which was disbanded, and they became the Jewish Brigade in 1944. And the Jewish Brigade, if they were young enough, then served in the Second World War and then in the War of Independence in 1948. And then some of them were old enough, or the right age, to serve in the Six-Day War. I've met guys in Israel who have ribbons. They don't give medals, they only have ribbons, going back from the First World War through to the Haganah ribbon, through to the Jewish Brigade ribbon, the Independence War ribbon, and the Six-Day War. They served in all those conflicts. So that's what we call fighting back.
Wow. quite incredible to think of that, all those world-affecting conflicts, and to live through it. But I suppose many people did.
Indeed they did.
Go through all those, yeah. Well, I think we're coming to the end. Obviously, I think the amount of information you've given us is pretty extensive, but if you want more information, obviously you want to go to the source, which is your book Fighting Back, and your other books as well. But I was thinking to finish with, if there was any particular idea or notion that you'd like people to take from this podcast, from your book, from the history itself, what would that be? Well,
I grew up in an East End Jewish home. All my family were in the forces. All the women lived through the Blitz. I had family in the First World War too. This stuff is very much in my conscience because as a boy, we always visited each other, big Jewish family in the East End, Sundays, Saturdays, and the uncles and aunts, conversation would always turn to the war. And then as I got older, I became aware of the Holocaust. I remember the first images I saw on TV of the liberation of Belsen by the British forces horrified me. I was about 10 years old. And I've been reading about the Holocaust and involved in Holocaust history ever since. I helped bring the Archivist exhibition to London, and wrote the education pack with another group of teachers and so on. My message is this: the Holocaust was, of course, a terrible, horrific event, probably the worst crime in history. Factories of death. No one had ever done that before to anybody. And the images that the Jews went to the slaughter, it's not true. There was much resistance, not just from the Jews who were free, not just from the Jews who went off and joined the partisans, left the ghettos and fought in the resistance, or rebelled in the camps. I mean, unbelievably important. But resistance took many forms. Staying alive was resistance. Running schools in the Terezin concentration camp for children and writing operas and letting them perform. There's been a lot about that on the media recently. That was resistance. Smuggling food in was resistance. Anything that showed the Nazis that we're still here, we ain't going nowhere, is resistance. And the Jews did this, but it's never really been part of the story when you study the Holocaust. And I think the two should be looked at together. And let me finish by saying, Sir Martin Gilbert, who was a good friend of mine in the last years of his life, the great historian, the Churchill's historian and Holocaust historian, he had the same view about this. And another great historian, Raoul Hilberg, who wrote the book Destruction of European Jewry, one of the first ever to be written about the Holocaust, he wrote a sequel before he died in America called Perpetrators and Resistors. And he researched, remember, a lot of this stuff was in Yiddish, Polish, and Russian, not in English. He spoke these languages and he researched the amount of resistance that Jews put up, even in small villages. And he tells this story of a Jewish shopkeeper who watched his wife and children murdered in a death pit. And as they were about to kill him, he grabbed this SS officer and dragged him into the pit and strangled him before anyone could shoot him, because he had this guy clutched in his arms and killed him, knowing that he was going to die too. This was the kind of event which was witnessed by some people who survived, by onlookers, Polish or Latvian or Lithuanian onlookers who were watching and collaborating with the Germans, and some Germans who took part, who survived the war, who told these stories to their children. They were written down. The Germans were great record keepers. They recorded everything. That's why we know a lot about the Holocaust. It's not through survivors only. The Germans recorded everything. That's why we know how true it is. They wrote it all down. We know the numbers and so on. So my message is, we did resist. It's just not often spoken enough about. That's what you should take away from this talk.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think you've definitely done your bit to remedy that imbalance.
Thank you.
The history there. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you.
I think that's the end of our podcast today. Just to remind everyone who's watching, this is the book, Fighting Back, and Martin has other books as well on related subjects. It's definitely extremely interesting. All the information that Martin's talked about is in here, plus a hell of a lot more. And there's lots of individual stories. It's very human, as well as the broad sweep of the conflict of the Second World War. Again, thank you very much, Martin.
Welcome.
Thank you, buddy. Goodbye.
Goodbye.